Hello, welcome to episode 5 of Conservation Conversations. This time we're going down to Australia to hear from Etienne Littlefair, who is a conservationist I met in South America. He was already introduced in the last video, and he has to be one of the most intrepid, fearless, adventurous conservationists and photographers that I've ever met in the field. The things this man can do with snakes and crocodiles and other deadly species are have to be seen to be believed, but you really have to draw it out of him, which is what I've tried to do at the end of this video to get him to tell you some of the more exotic stories that he's got around snakes and crocodiles and deadly creatures and things like that. One of which is in this video, but most of which you'll have to look at the extras video for how you survive a brown snake party crawling in on your belly, and how you come face to face with a crocodile underwater and don't get bitten in half. So do enjoy that extras video and this insight into the conservation and ecology of Australia. Enjoy!
Yeah, my name's Etienne Littlefair. I grew up in the UK where I studied a degree in zoology and conservation before starting to work as a freelance ecology consultant, which meant spending a lot of time in the field surveying for legally protected species that may or may not have been present at proposed development sites, and then designing action plans to try and prevent harmful impacts to those species. In between stints of doing that, I worked for a conservation charity in England, based in England, called Operation Wallacea. And their focus was lots of overseas tropical field work, with a focus on preserving local ecosystems and integrating local peoples into that. And whilst I was doing that, I was working particularly as an amphibian and reptile specialist or herpetologist. And at one time, I was based in Ecuador, and that is where I met your teacher, Mr. Gill, and also some fantastic students that he brought over from Coventry at the time. Since then, I've done various jobs since then, but I suppose the big step after that was moving over to Australia, where I studied a master's degree in natural resource management at James Cook University in North Queensland. During that time, I also did some work in that field around the degree and shortly thereafter as well, which took me to lots of Indigenous communities up on the Cape York Peninsula, which is that very northern tip of Queensland, heading up towards Papua New Guinea. So it was focused around, I suppose, changing human practices around farming, around resource extraction, and also around traditional harvesting of food by Indigenous peoples. Just to try and manage things so that wildlife populations could bounce back in areas where they've been badly impacted, and also doing things in such a way that we were not having such negative effects on the carbon cycle and on fire regimes, which is a big thing in Australia. Yeah. Since that time, I've moved to Darwin, which is right smack bang in the centre of the sort of northern coastline of Australia. It's in a place called the Northern Territory. And over here, my main work has been actually as a science teacher. But during that time, I've had a lot of involvement with a few community programs. So groups that we call land care groups that manage particular plots of land, usually for the benefit of wildlife, for conservation purposes. Yeah. And I've had a lot of involvement with the Northern Territory Museum and Art Gallery as well, as a kind of I guess it's almost like a consultant on exhibits that they've been producing that work with wildlife or natural history. And then I'm also an active member of the Northern Territory Field Naturalists Group. Yeah, and then I suppose most recently, my conservation focus has been on using imagery video as well to promote conservation causes. And I've been partnering with a few different institutions in Australia on that.
Now, you, as far as I remember, and it sounds like you've continued, are one of the most fearless and intrepid ecologists that I've worked with. I mean, there's in terms of the amount of field work that you've done, the amount of places you've been, you are the only person to have used the phrase "hold that to me" while holding a live caiman. And that was a pretty extreme conservation moment. So really, you could have ended up, I think, anywhere in the world, in any environment, and done your conservation there. So why is it that you found that the Northern Territory, specifically that area of Australia, was so compelling and so important? What is it about that area of the world that's so important in terms of its wildlife, its biodiversity, and its nature?
Well, the Northern Territory presents a really unique conservation opportunity for people for various reasons. But um, the gist of it is that it's a huge land area. I'm not actually entirely sure of its spatial extent, but we're
Hmm.
talking multiple European countries crammed together, with a total population of probably around about 250,000 people, slightly less, in fact. So, in terms of population densities of humans, it's extremely low. And as a result, it has some of the most intact tropical savanna habitats left anywhere on Earth. Um, so as soon as you start taking people off of the land and out of the equation,
Mm.
generally you start whittling down on the amount of impact we have on what's there. There's less people causing disturbance, there's less vehicles, there's less hunting, there's less roads. Um, so yeah, it presents a great opportunity for conservation, and I suppose that's what attracted me here in the first place was access to those
Yeah.
environments, and also as a photographer, um, it's a fairly pioneering area. There aren't
Mm.
too many people up here that have spent time documenting the wildlife, particularly the aquatic stuff, which is what I'm very interested in. So it presented me with a unique opportunity to have a large backyard to play around in.
Absolutely, sounds absolutely perfect for what I know you to be into. We'll talk about photography a bit later, but you mentioned your introduction there that you've had a little bit to do with kind of people in the landscape and agriculture and all that kind of stuff. One of our main syllabus points is on conflicts, so particularly with farming, but also with mining and with other land uses. So, in your experience in the Northern Territories or in Australia, where have you seen sort of human and agricultural requirements sort of come into conflict with agriculture or with conservation? And have you seen anywhere where they've worked particularly well together, where there's good examples of agriculturalists and conservationists working well together in Australia?
I'll start with the conflict because in the Northern Territory, at least, that's probably the easier one to explain. So one of the big cash crops around the Darwin area, so that's crops that we produce
Yeah.
en masse for selling elsewhere in Australia, and some go overseas as well, as mangoes. So it's one of the biggest
Okay.
mango growing areas in Australia. And you wouldn't think that because mangoes are
No.
normally grown in very wet environments. But Darwin is only wet for half the year. We have a wet season and then we have a dry season where you get essentially no rain at all, quite literally, for up to 6 months of the year,
Hmm.
even sometimes slightly longer. Um, so these mangoes require irrigation year round to
Right.
grow, and the extent of the plantations means that we are taking millions and millions of liters of groundwater out of underground aquifers using boreholes and pumps every year, and as a result, we actually came very close last year during the dry season to running out of water in the Greater Darwin area.
Wow.
And when I say that, it's probably quite difficult to imagine living in a country like the UK that has rainfall year round. But it's a very scary situation because not only are you looking at a scarcity of water for your daily living routines, but if there's no water, you also can't fight fire, which is a huge issue in the landscape here at the moment.
Yeah.
Um, and that brings me. There's another. I suppose there's another two big farming issues I can think of quickly up here. One is that as well as water, these mango crops and some of the other local crops require fertilization on a fairly regular basis because we
Yeah.
have very old, very nutrient deficient soils in the in Australia that are prone to leaching. So a lot of the valuable nutrients and minerals that are in the water and in the soil end up I guess leaching out when it rains heavily during the summer months.
Mm.
So phosphorus is the really big thing that tends to be lacking, but there's generally fairly low nitrogen content as well.
Yeah.
Um, as a result, when fertilization happens on a grand scale, and it happens sometimes at the wrong time of year before the heavy rains come, you can get a lot of runoff going into river systems and creeks, which causes something called eutrophication,
Yeah.
where the levels of nutrients in water increase artificially, and there can be a lack of oxygen in the water as a result. You end up getting massive growths of algae, whereas a lot of the water plants, fish, turtles, things like that can suffer as a consequence. Um, Yeah, and that's harmful to the wildlife, but also that's harmful on an economic level because a
Hmm.
lot of our domestic tourism in the Northern Territory is Australian freshwater fishermen coming up to catch barramundi. So if
Right.
we stuff up our waterways, then we end up actually losing out on that source of revenue generation as well. Um, Third big issue that occurs to me for the Northern Territory is connected to the cattle industry. Um, so the conflict here is to do with national parks, really.
Yeah.
Large land areas are managed in the Northern Territory for cattle as cattle stations. So,
Hmm.
to all intents and purposes, these areas appear to be naturally vegetated. And unless you see the cattle or the farm vehicles and things, you wouldn't necessarily know that there was farming going on. But that's what most land up here is used for. And typically the density of cattle can be a little bit higher than what the land really can support
Okay.
in terms of the growth of grasses and things they need to feed, and in terms of the surface water available for them to drink. And sometimes in dry years, which we've had in, increasingly dry years
Mm.
recently, connected to climate change, we think, um, cattle simply don't have enough food. And when that happens, they are often allowed by their owners to move into national parks where the
Right.
only grazing animals present probably would be wallabies and sometimes kangaroos, but in relatively smaller numbers. So
Yeah.
they tend to not strip all of the available vegetation, whereas cattle will. And when that happens, obviously it's bad for those wallabies and kangaroos, but it also makes it easier for predators like birds of prey, eagles, hawks, that kind of thing, to capture
Okay.
small mammals, small reptiles, that kind of thing. And of course, you end up then with a conservation dilemma because from a management perspective, if parks were to kick the cattle out, which in itself is a big expensive job,
Yeah.
then they're often labelled as the bad guys because they're having a negative impact on the cattle industry, which is also kind of a lifeblood generation
Yeah.
of money for the Northern Territory. So big conflict there.
Mm. Are there any areas where people have worked well together, where these kind of sort of where these examples have actually managed to balance the needs of farmers and conservationists?
Yeah. So absolutely. I don't have too many examples from the Northern Territory. When I was in North Queensland, however, I saw some really good examples. One of the big crops over there is sugarcane,
Hmm.
which does have its negative sides
Yeah.
as well. But around the sugarcane, I saw and sometimes helped with the development of local natural resource management groups, which were funded at that time by a grant from the federal government. And what these groups were collections of, I suppose, generally expert people who had come from an academic background,
Okay.
and they were usually set up around water catchment areas. So there might be two or three different groups spaced strategically within one river catchment system,
Hmm.
and each group would take on responsibility for liaising with the farmers within their sort of zone in the catchment. And what that was a kind of a collaborative effort between the scientists and the land managers, the farmers, to
Yeah.
try and basically to try and create practices that were able to meet human needs at the same time as meeting the needs of the local wildlife. And in practice, what that ended up looking like sometimes was working out when was the right time to fertilize so that you didn't get the runoff going into the creeks.
Okay. Yeah.
Or maybe there are certain types of fertilizer products that work better in certain areas. Or maybe sometimes farmers were growing crops that weren't particularly appropriate for their soil type or their proximity to a wetland.
Mm.
And sometimes it was possible to research and find a better cash generating crop that was actually less harmful
Yeah.
to the environment than sugarcane per se. One of the ones we found that farmers would switch to quite reliably in North Queensland were sweet potatoes,
Okay.
which are a healthy food for people.
Yeah.
They required far less input of nutrients into the soils. They were less thirsty for water, but there was a big market for them, so it was good.
Mm.
A
Smart.
big part of the natural resource management groups there as well was to get access to land, which allowed for them to carry out things like feral animal control, which is massively important in North Queensland. There's a lot of pigs, that tend to get into the nests of reptiles, particularly eat their eggs. So it has a really big impact on things like turtle recruitment.
Yeah.
So that's new individuals coming into populations. So by gaining access for researchers into these farmland areas, it just created a greater network where you could be controlling the impact a bit more of these things. And sometimes it allowed for the establishment of wildlife corridors too, which I know is something that happens in the UK sometimes, where farms might leave certain strips of land
Yeah.
to kind of connect bits of habitat.
Yeah.
That was a really big thing in North Queensland for cassowaries, which are huge, big birds, a little bit, closely related to ostriches and emus, and a very iconic species for Northern Australia as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we'll crack on then to the idea of specific data gathering. So you say you've been involved in these projects. So not necessarily in Australia, but when you are working as a conservationist, I'm sure you remember the way ecological techniques are taught in UK schools in terms of, going across a field with a transect and counting the daisies, and it doesn't really necessarily connect with the real world of ecology. So I was wondering if you can give some examples of some of the data gathering that you've been involved in, how that data gathering works, and where the data goes. What is it used for? What does it do?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I'll go back in time a bit to when I was working in the UK as an ecology consultant a little bit. I, as a freelance, would get contacted by a company that worked in that ecology field when they had been requested to do survey works at a proposed development site. And I, as a researcher, I suppose, would go to that site and determine what was the best method of collecting data on the particular group of fauna or flora that they were interested in. And my expertise at that time was mostly around reptiles and amphibians. So in practice, my methods in the UK often involved a combination of laying out bits of tin, which reptiles use to help them thermoregulate to the right temperature, and then sort of putting them strategically, looking underneath them a set number of times, that kind of thing, and recording the species that I was finding there. But then I would also have to do this at certain times of the year, specifically for amphibians like great crested newts.
Yeah.
So they're only actually in the water during the spring when they breed. And so that's actually the only time you can survey for them, which means that if a site needs to be surveyed for them, then the development gets held up until at least that survey can have happened in a springtime. And the way we did that was a combination of different tactics. It involved literally visual surveys, so walking around the edges of waterways at night with a torch, and that's when they're active. So that's when you see them. Recording how many you see, what their sex is, any juveniles, that kind of thing. But then we also use something called bottle traps, which I'm not going to tell you how to make them, but it's a very effective way of capturing these newts, and it doesn't harm them at all. So you put the traps out at night, then you come back in the morning, and you can just count how many there are. And then that information was just my part of the project. But in more academic or research oriented field works that I've done, things get a little bit more interesting. So when I worked for Operation Wallacea and met Mr. Gill, I was going out to sites that we had very, very little knowledge of at all in terms of what species lived there, how many there were, whether they were being impacted by local peoples, none of that stuff at all. Oftentimes, and so I was generally looking again at reptiles and amphibians, and I would go with an idea in my head of what might be there, based on the general habitat and area that we were looking at, but also with a view to potentially finding new things as well. And sometimes we did, which was exciting. But to do that, you have to be very familiar with all of the possibilities. So you have to have a lot of either knowledge stored in your head or information available to you in the field, so you can rule out things. Collecting data there, we didn't have a large budget, and we didn't have a lot of equipment or materials, so we were generally using fairly basic methods again of determining where our access points to the environments were, and typically just doing visual surveys, so walking on foot at different times of day and night to target species that were active at different times. paying particular focus to wetland areas and areas around water, because that's where reptiles and amphibians tend to spend, well, a lot of species tend to spend a lot of their time near water. And then when we found them, it often involved exciting things like capturing them and counting how many scales they had in particular parts of their bodies to make a really good firm identification of them. At that stage, I was also taking a lot of photographs of specimens so that when I got back to the UK afterwards, I had a bit. If I was unsure of anything, I could clarify it. It was that was a bit of a unique situation, because really I was just trying to form a baseline of what species were there, because Operation Wallacea at that point were really just trying to establish what was going on at this site and what could they actually do to benefit the site. So I find research more interesting when you've got a more, I don't know, academic question that you want to answer. My big interest over here for the last few years has been freshwater turtles. So I'm now really interested in what are the impacts of bushfires on their breeding success, which seems like an odd question because they are aquatic, obviously. Most of the time they're in the water, and fires typically don't, they don't burn in the water.
Well, quite,
But no. But from my observations that I've had through photography, I've noticed that young turtles of a lot of species rely on a particular species of aquatic vegetation called pandanus. And these pandanus have got aquatic root systems that come through the banks of creeks, and they provide fantastic shelter for these young turtles, which can only, sometimes they're only a few centimeters long. So there's a lot of predators out there that will go for them. Other bigger turtles, fish, snakes, herons, birds of prey, crocodiles, and certain species of monitor lizard will also eat them. So they have a lot of predators. And so when this vegetation is present, they have a fighting chance of being able to stay hidden for long enough. They can grow big enough that they can avoid these predators. But when you get a big fire through, if this vegetation burns, then suddenly you've got a situation where turtles can lay eggs, they can hatch, but none of the youngsters are actually surviving at all. One of the things that got me interested in this also was noticing through my own observations in the Northern Territory that we almost exclusively see either adult or young adult sized turtles. We very rarely encounter juveniles at all. And in Australia, that it's been recognised for a long time that this lack of recruitment of juveniles within turtle species has been impacting populations in New South Wales and southern areas of Queensland. So areas where there's a lot more people. That's been a known thing for a long time, but no one else has really given it any thought in the Northern Territory yet. So at the moment, I'm sort of collaborating with a couple of other people to try and investigate that a little bit more.
So it's an important nursery area for basically the whole of that coast of Australia, pretty much what we're saying, that sort of area seeds all the more populous areas.
Yeah. And one of the things that's really hammered this home is, I know this is something you want to talk about, but last year there were huge bushfires all across Australia that made it into the international media. And what a lot of people might not realise is that Australia actually has huge amounts of fire every year. And the reason it was so bad last year was because we'd had several years of reduced rainfall compared to our long-term average, and we've seen a steady increase in temperatures in line with kind of global projections for what's going on with climate change and the general warming of the planet. So those two things kind of come together and result in Australia as a nation basically becoming a giant tinderbox. And so we've seen a lot of area, even though we do often get fires, the intensity of these fires as a result of the lack of moisture and increased temperatures resulted in these fires getting into a lot of habitats that don't typically burn. So normally it would be extremely rare, as in an event that maybe we would expect to happen once every few hundred or even few thousand years, that a big creek line would actually have a fire come right up to the banks. But we've actually been seeing that happen year on year for the past sort of 3-4 years in the Northern Territory now. And even though we have this big open landscape with relatively few people, that in itself has such a big impact from a conservation perspective that we have a real challenge on our hands, to try and deal with that, because it's yeah, you almost have to fix
Yeah,
our climate issues in order to tackle that challenge.
yeah. Well, let's deal with that question now. Then, I mean, because obviously the syllabus link here is successional processes, and you've talked about Australian bushfires, which obviously you do want to talk about. That they are a natural part of the ecology in Australia. That there are some species out there that need plant species that need fire to germinate. But with the sort of fires that we're seeing now, they're obviously doing bigger, larger amounts of damage. Um, what sort of timescale are we talking in terms of recovery, in terms of the successional processes taking place to have eucalyptus forest recover?
Yeah, yeah.
And is that are you seeing that in any I know it's early days, but
Mm.
are we seeing any recovery?
Well, up here, the Northern Territory, there are two kind of prominent types of forest system in the sort of northern parts of the territory where I'm experienced with. And that's kind of open savanna woodland type stuff where
Yeah.
you do have lots of trees and they're a little bit spaced out, lots of grasses and shrubs in between. And then you have something really special called monsoon vine thickets, which are
Okay.
generally either coastal or grow along rivers, and sometimes in rocky kind of gorges that sort of hold moisture better through the dry season. And the reason these little pockets of monsoon vine thicket are very special is that they're sort of relict leftover patches of forest from when most of Australia was a lot wetter. Plant species associated with that habitat type either now only occur in North Queensland or in these little isolated pockets that we have. And fire impacts the open woodland versus these monsoon pockets very differently. So normally these monsoon vine thickets don't burn. We don't expect them to ever burn. And as a result, the trees that are and plants that live within those habitats are actually not adapted to deal with fire whatsoever.
Right.
So if they do burn, then what happens is that those trees and those plants get replaced with trees and species that are used to being burnt and can cope with fire. So over time, if a fire affects these monsoon vine thickets, you end up with just a gradual reduction in the spatial extent of those habitat types. So in terms of that forest type, when fire happens,
It's not
we don't
coming back.
actually see any recovery ever. That's it.
Wow.
Because in order for that forest type to expand, you actually need there to be a surplus of water available,
Yeah.
which would mean almost year-round rain, or at least so much rain during the wet season that things remained wet for several months of the year without any rain,
Yeah.
and frankly, it doesn't happen.
It's realistically not going to
So
occur. So.
within the local area of Darwin, where these forest patches occur,
Mm.
sometimes local land care groups, including ones I've been involved with have actually installed irrigation systems around the edge of the forest and manually taken seeds from these
Yeah.
trees, grown them in greenhouse type conditions, and then planted them at a stage where they're more likely to survive and start thriving. And that
Yep.
has worked quite well.
Mm.
But because there's such a small human population base in the Northern Territory, that's only ever going to work for the small areas around
Yeah.
Darwin.
Well, that kind of
So
restoration ecology is so labour intensive, isn't it? That realistically, for an area
absolutely,
that's so large as what you're talking about,
yeah.
that's only going to be
So
a
even
drop in the
it,
ocean.
yeah, a drop in the ocean is a very good way of putting it. And even in North Queensland, where rainforest habitats are much more prevalent,
Mm.
creating corridors. We mentioned on farmland sometimes
Yep.
for
Yeah.
the
Yep. Yep.
cassowaries.
Connectivity and all
That
that.
that that process, even where that habitat is supposed to exist, that process can take 2 decades,
Wow.
and require almost constant human, manpower, people going to the site on at least a weekly basis to
Yeah.
checking the water. It actually involves a lot of pest plant control as well, because a lot of invasive plants can exploit those sort of early, or what's the word I'm looking for, early successional stages
Yeah.
in the development of a forest system before you get that closed canopy above that where you get the shade that allows a lot of these shade loving plants to grow up in. But we'll bring it back to territory for a second. So,
Mm.
aside from the monsoon vine forests, you have open savanna woodland, and yeah, we get a lot of acacia trees and eucalypt species that grow in that environment. Typically, they're very good at coping with fire. So they tend to have a a thickened bark layer that helps to protect their cambium, which is a sort of a living part of the plant tissue just underneath the bark of the trees,
Yeah.
that is responsible for nutrient uptake and things like that. Um, so this thickened bark that they have will actually provide a lot of insulation against low intensity fires at least, and as a result, these plants can they can survive as long as the fires aren't too extreme. If you do get a very hot fire and that burns, let's say more than 2 or 3 meters in height in terms of the flames, then you run into situations where you get canopy scorch. So that's where lots of the smaller branches and all of the leaves within the crown of a tree can dehydrate and die. If that happens, then these trees are still susceptible to burns. And with the more intense burns that we've been seeing, I've actually personally seen a lot of that already this year, even let alone last year. But the good news is that that habitat system generally is fairly good at coping with fire. So what you'll see in the long term, if we continue to have these extreme fire events, is a reduction in the number of big trees. I think in terms of timelines for recovery, for a full recovery, I haven't been in the territory for long enough to see this, but from the reading I've done and from talking to colleagues, usually something in the region of about 30 years is required for a full recovery after an intense fire has come through an open savanna area. Whereas if you have a sort of low intensity, what we call grass fires over here, where it really is just the understory that burns, you'll actually see seasonal recovery. So each year you'll see fresh growth coming up in those areas. And after when it starts raining, after the dry season ends, these eucalypts and acacias often actually slough their bark. So a lot of the sort of thick burnt bits of bark around the base of the trees will actually just fall off, and that in itself provides quite good habitat for a lot of animals like reptiles, small mammals to hide under, that kind of thing.
Great. What's the most successful thing? If the manual stuff is really hard work and takes an awful lot of input, maybe that's not the best way to go, or maybe it is, I don't know. What do you think the most successful form of Australian conservation is, and why do you think it is that people are damaging their environments in the first place? It's a question I'm asking to everybody.
If I have to give one thing, I would say it's the formation and establishment of private organizations that manage land for wildlife, and there's a couple of very good reasons for that. So a really good case study example will be the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Everyone over here just refers to them as AWC for short. And they have a large donor base within the general Australian populace, and they now manage a very, very large tracts of land across every state and territory. And in some areas, they've almost caught up with the national park system, which is great. And the really good thing about them is that conservation is their sole agenda. Obviously, their financial situation can fluctuate. Whereas in national parks and areas that rely on direct government regulation and financing, they're very subject to the whims of the political party of the day. Yeah, and then I will say one thing for the country as a whole here. So this is a product of the low human population density and the amount of land space available. But Australia has historically done a very good job of setting aside land as national parks, particularly in the less populated parts of the country. Just because the place is so big, there's so much land available that we can have large enough protected areas that don't suffer from the kind of edge effects that you may have you talked about that with your students? Or
well, there's lots of other examples in these other videos of people moving into protected areas around the edges and connectivity. The idea of small protected areas not being suitable for larger carnivores, particularly, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So the spatial extent of a lot of our parks, no one would question that they're big enough to support the largest predators that we have, and they're I suppose that the amount of those habitats that is kind of on the edges a lot less than in a lot of other countries.
The other part was, why do you think it is that people in various parts of the world, doesn't have to be Australia, actually do damage their habitat? Because in my experience, people don't want to damage the environment in which they live. They're all quite attached to their own environments. But why do you think it is they actually damage the environment that they're in?
So, environmental processes happen over very long periods of time
Mm,
compared to a typical human lifespan, or even compared to what we can observe on a sort of day to day basis. Whereas a human, a typical human, has a lot of immediate wants and needs that to be satisfied, um, and that require a significant amount of resources from the environment around them. It's often difficult for people to actually see a direct knock-on effect of or consequence of their decisions or their actions on their own personal environment around them. Yeah, so that'd be one reason, is that the lack of direct
yeah,
observation of the damage that is being done.
out of sight, out of
But
mind, basically.
that being said, I've seen plenty of even indigenous peoples who live fairly traditional lifestyles also
Mm.
degrade their environment to a very poor standard. And that's probably a fairly political comment, but it's not intended in that way. It's just a
No,
direct
that's fine.
observation.
It's your
Um,
observation. That's
yeah,
what we're here for. So
when you get a situation like that, when you have a resource that's shared between large groups of people, it ultimately, the logical thing to do for each person is to try and maximize their profit from that environment, um, at every possible opportunity.
yeah,
Because if they don't, they're actually losing out to other people around them, and there will then be less of that resource for them. That's actually compounded by human population growth. So
yeah,
pretty much everywhere on the planet, we've had explosive population growth over the past few decades. And so, as well as people um, not wanting to limit their own personal gains, there are more and more people coming into the equation all the time, and they
yeah.
always everyone needs to be taking resources from the environment. Because even if you're not directly cutting down a tree, every time that you access a product like that, that has some environmental consequence somewhere.
And so we've got short termism, we've got out of sight, out of mind, and more people in the equation. I think is a very good summary of why it is that people damage and degrade their environment. So to
Yeah.
bring it back to a specific syllabus point, um, sort of thinking about those things you've just said, do you have any ideas, any of your in your experience, what are the best ways to balance up the needs of conservation and the needs of people? Because people aren't going anywhere. The explosive
Yeah.
population growth you talk about is, it's not going to stop. There are various predictions on when it is going to stop and when it's going to peak. So, in your experience, how do we sort of mitigate?
I don't see a solution that's going to stop people who are allowed to access that common resource. There are some environmental requirements and protections that govern how we can impact the environment on a major scale. What we don't have is, we don't have systems that ever account for the cumulative impact of multiple different actions at once. So this is the
Right.
same in the UK as it is in Australia, and this is actually one of the main reasons why climate change has gotten as out of hand as it has.
Yeah.
Um, for example, right now, one of the biggest coal mines in the world is currently under development. It's called the Adani coal mine, and it's in the east coast of Queensland. Kind of, it's in a big basin called the Galilee Basin,
Yeah.
and you'd think in this day and age, with all of our conventions and global awareness about how much greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere and what the effects are, that there'll be some provision within the legislation system of Australia to stop that
Yeah.
action from happening. But it's been through the courts, and the sole reason why we can't use legislation to stop that from happening is because the action of opening that coal mine is judged exclusively on its own merits and negatives.
Right.
You cannot, legally, as a judge, you cannot look at the impacts caused by that development in conjunction with the impacts caused by another coal mine. So even though it's going to
Okay.
be a huge coal mine and produce more coal than any other mine ever has, you can't. That's not. It's still a drop in the sea of coal in total.
Yeah.
And because you can't consider it with alongside others legally, then it's not a problem. So it will go ahead.
Yeah.
The same can be said with small scale developments too. So let's say you have a rare species of parrot. We'll say the golden shouldered parrot, which is
Yep.
from the North Queensland. They have a relatively small distribution and very specific habitat requirements. Um, but and they are protected. Like you aren't allowed to go out there and shoot them or harm them or catch them in any way. And if a development is to occur within their distribution, it will have to be assessed. But let's say that proposal will take up 10% of the total available habitat. That will probably be allowed. That's probably okay because they still have 90% of their habitat.
Mm-hmm.
But what doesn't occur there is, let's say there's a second development that's happening
Yeah.
simultaneously and a third, and each of those developments also take up a further 10%. People that are judging whether or not this is allowed to go ahead are not allowed to consider the fact that there are multiple projects happening
Right.
simultaneously.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point. Not one we've had made so far. The idea that each individual item is looked at in isolation rather than
Yeah,
anyone having sort of any vision for looking at the whole. So things end up
yeah,
getting nibbled away at and all that kind of stuff. So I mean, I guess
yeah.
that leads to a slightly different topic, which is your photography. Now, I obviously enjoy whenever I see your pictures crop up because not only are they incredible wildlife pictures and fantastic resource of wildlife things, but the thought I have is, how the hell did he take that? I think you're one of the people who puts yourself in sort of more extreme positions and takes, if you like, takes more risks in capturing your photographs than anybody else that I know. So you obviously feel that photography and that capturing of wildlife is really, really important. So why do you think it is that the sort of more artistic and creative pursuit of photography, videography is so important in conservation?
Okay. Well, for me, I feel that if people are going to be investing resources and effort into protecting something, they're only going to do that if they really care for it, even if they love it in the first place.
Mm.
Otherwise, why would they bother? And the other thing I know from experience growing up in England is that you don't, unless you make big effort, you often don't actually come into contact with much wildlife. You don't see much of it unless it's on the TV,
Yeah.
or you're very lucky and live near maybe Dartmoor or the Scottish Highlands or somewhere like that. So for me, the artistic side, the photography, videography, all of it comes back to just actually bringing wildlife to people, showing people that it's out there, what it is. And you'll notice most of my photos, I give a fairly descriptive caption of the situation,
Yeah.
sometimes a bit of background information about the animal. And for me, the specifics of that isn't important. It's just sharing snippets about animals to make them more real, so that they're
Yeah.
not just something that are in a textbook or on a television. It's trying to help people to know what's there, so that they connect to it in some way, or maybe be inspired to go out and have a look at it for themselves. Yeah, there's definitely a big role there for more artistic pursuits in terms of nature. I think even photography and art stuff like what Rory McCann does with his wall murals and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. I think people love that stuff. I think that they can really connect with it, and they can really appreciate sort of nature's beauty in a very visceral way, if you capture that right moment, or paint that right scene. And in doing so, I think you're bringing more supporters into the fold for conservation on the whole. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and just because I've been privy to either been there for or heard you talk about some of your amazing stories about how you capture some of these photos. Could you, for the benefit of the people watching, share some of your perhaps most extreme or most risky um, photography shoots, or some particularly memorable photographs that you've taken and things like that. 'Cause I remember things like you putting hats over snakes to get the camera nice and
Yeah.
close, and then whipping the hat off before the thing bites you, all that kind of stuff. Anything like that
Well,
that you can share?
yeah, of course. We can start with one of those stories from Ecuador. We were at the Nenkapari camp,
Yeah,
the one in the Amazon basin. Yeah, and
absolutely.
we
Yeah.
had a small little long drop toilet that was in a hut in the middle of the camp.
Ah,
And
yes, the snake toilet. I remember it well.
yes, the snake toilet. So
Yes.
the very first day, someone went in there and immediately said there was a snake. And I had my suspicions that it would probably be something less pleasant than most people would have liked. So I went to the bathroom with my snake hook, and sure enough, it was a small fer-de-lance.
Hmm.
So I put him in a bag, and I did show the students so that they all knew what this snake was, and that they mustn't go anywhere near it really, because they can be fairly defensive if they feel cornered. And yeah, me and Mika, or Dr. Peck, took the snake for a little walk up the forest trail, a couple of kilometers away from camp, and we did exactly what you said. Wanted to document it, so I put my camera on a tripod with a shutter release cable, so I didn't have to put my hands anywhere near where the snake's strike range was, and
Yeah.
calmed the snake down by using my kind of bush hat, which is a typical, I think, Indiana Jones type thing, hat over the top. And after leaving him in the dark for a few seconds, he was calm enough to take the hat off and use that shutter release cable from a distance to get that image. And that's a fairly common practice for field herpetologists when if they want to catch a photograph of a venomous snake within the habitat.
Yeah.
Um, and I used to do that, employ that method a lot, but nowadays I actually go to even greater lengths and possibly risks as well, in that I only ever capture animals actually naturally now. I a few years ago decided that I there's enough people out there in the world taking images for field guides that I didn't really need that sort of photo in my portfolio. I was more after natural behaviors, natural
Yeah.
scenes without disturbance. So when I photograph venomous snakes now, I do it in a manner so that they're completely unmanipulated, unrestrained, and that often involves very slowly kind of crawling up to them on my belly, to still get my camera very close to them. And I find that sometimes the easiest way to do that is to observe them for long periods of time and wait until they're feeding, because when they're feeding, they can't bite you.
Well, there you go. So definitely someone you want to have around in the field, right? In case you come up against a fer-de-lance yourself. So do check out the extras video. There's a couple more of Etienne's stories there about how to deal with particularly deadly species, how to enter a brown snake feeding frenzy on your belly and come out unbitten, and how to come nose to nose with a crocodile underwater and not get bitten in half. Do make sure you watch that as well, because he gives some really useful and interesting careers advice on how you can actually end up in ecology and conservation if that's what you want to do. And next up, it's episode 6, the last in the series, where we cover Asia and go to Indonesia.